The concept of Camelot remains one of the most enduring illusions in American political history, a carefully manufactured tapestry of youth, vigor, and intellectual sophistication that deliberately obscured a much darker, highly volatile reality. When John F. Kennedy ascended to the presidency, he brought with him an unprecedented understanding of the power of visual media, transforming the bleak landscape of Cold War politics into a stage play of domestic bliss and generational renewal. The iconic imagery of a young, suntan leader navigating the perilous waters of international diplomacy while maintaining the role of a devoted family man was no historical accident. It was a masterclass in public relations. Beneath this pristine veneer, however, lay a subterranean world of compulsive risk-taking, systemic deception, and a relentless pursuit of personal gratification that constantly threatened to derail the executive branch. The dichotomy between the public statesman and the private predator defines the true complexity of the Kennedy administration, revealing a man who viewed his immense political power not as a mandate for moral restraint, but as an absolute shield against personal accountability. This deep dive analysis seeks to dismantle the mythology of the 35th president, exploring how his private impulses actively jeopardized national security, corrupted the integrity of federal institutions, and left a trail of emotional devastation that the mainstream media willingly ignored for decades. To comprehend the sheer scale of this historical deception, one must look closely at the architectural foundation of the Kennedy image, which was largely constructed, refined, and maintained by Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy. When the young senator married the aristocratic, multilingual heiress in 1953, the union was less a traditional romance and more a highly calculated merger of political ambition and cultural prestige. Jackie brought an unparalleled sense of European elegance, historical awareness, and aesthetic perfection to a political brand that had previously been defined by the aggressive rough-and-tumble tactics of the Boston Democratic machine. She single-handedly transformed her husband from a somewhat disheveled, physically frail congressional representative into a cinematic symbol of American royalty, meticulously curating everything from his wardrobe to the interior design of their homes. This aesthetic revolution reached its absolute zenith during the 1960 presidential campaign, where the couple projected an image of effortless vitality that contrasted sharply with the stiff, bureaucratic persona of Vice President Richard Nixon. The public fell deeply in love with the cinematic narrative of a brilliant, forward-looking leader supported by an ultra-chic, fiercely loyal wife, completely unaware that the foundation of this marriage was already fractured by a chronic, escalating pattern of marital infidelity and profound emotional distance. Once inside the White House, the Kennedy administration immediately weaponized the concept of transparency to hide the profound darkness occurring behind closed doors, utilizing the press corps as an unwitting marketing agency for the first family. Photographs of the Kennedy children, Caroline and John Jr., playing joyfully beneath the historic Resolute desk in the Oval Office were distributed globally, creating a powerful emotional anchor that humanized the terrifying realities of the nuclear age. The American public looked at these carefully staged snapshots and saw an anchor of stability, a testament to traditional family values, and a promise that the future of the Republic was in safe, nurturing hands. Jackie's highly publicized, historically rigorous restoration of the executive mansion further cemented this illusion, turning the White House into a living museum of American continuity and cultural sophistication that captivated international dignitaries. This brilliant staging created a psychological barrier through which the public could not see, establishing a level of emotional goodwill so immense that even the most cynical Washington journalists found themselves protective of the president. The myth of Camelot was born out of this collective desire for romanticism, a national longing for an era of political idealism that deliberately chose to celebrate the beautiful theater while ignoring the rot beneath the floorboards. However, the dark contrast between this public spectacle and Kennedy's private conduct was not an affliction that developed during his presidency. It was a deeply ingrained behavioral matrix established during his early political career. Throughout his tenure in the House of Representatives and the United States Senate, rumors of Kennedy's insatiable appetite for extramarital encounters circulated quietly through the exclusive corridors of the nation's capital. Yet the mainstream media landscape of the mid-20th century operated under a strict, unwritten code of gentlemen's agreements, where a politician's private indiscretions were deemed entirely irrelevant to their public duties. Journalists who were fully aware of Kennedy's reckless behavioral patterns chose to remain silent, viewing his frequent trysts as mere peccadillos of a wealthy, charismatic young man rather than symptoms of a profound character flaw. This protective wall of journalistic silence granted Kennedy a dangerous sense of psychological invulnerability, convincing him that his wealth, status, and immense charm could insulate him from any meaningful social or political consequences. As a result, his private life grew increasingly daring, transitioning from casual opportunistic encounters into a highly structured, covert operation designed to facilitate his desires while maintaining the absolute purity of his public profile. The true dangerous epicenter of Kennedy's pre-presidential social life was his deep, symbiotic intersection with the dark underbelly of the American entertainment industry, most notably through his intimate friendship with Frank Sinatra. Sinatra, the undisputed leader of the legendary Hollywood Rat Pack, provided the ambitious young politician with a direct pipeline to an alternative universe of absolute glamour, unbridled hedonism, and immense organized wealth. The exclusive casinos of Las Vegas, the sun-drenched estates of Palm Springs, and private alcohol-fueled dinners in New York became the neutral territory where high-stakes political networking blended seamlessly with extreme personal indulgence. In these environments, Kennedy was introduced to a revolving door of Hollywood starlets, high society hostesses, and beautiful sycophants who were drawn to his intoxicating aura of rising political power and masculine confidence. Sinatra acted as both a cultural amplifier for the Kennedy brand and a discreet facilitator of his private appetites, creating an exclusive playground where traditional moral boundaries simply ceased to exist. This dangerous blurring of the lines between elite public service and reckless Hollywood hedonism laid the groundwork for severe lapses in judgment, setting a precedent where the future president felt entirely comfortable operating simultaneously in the worlds of legitimate governance and illicit indulgence. As Kennedy's political ambitions expanded toward the highest office in the land, his innermost circle of trusted aides and political operatives were forced to adapt, effectively transforming into a highly efficient administrative apparatus for his private secrets. Men like Dave Powers and Kenny O'Donnell, whose official titles suggested a focus on national policy and campaign strategy, frequently found their energies diverted toward the meticulous coordination of the president's secret personal encounters. Travel schedules were engineered with mathematical precision to allow for brief, untraceable interludes with various women, ensuring that these high-risk meetings never appeared on official logs or Secret Service manifests. The protective perimeter of the presidency, originally designed by federal law to safeguard the life of the commander-in-chief from foreign adversaries, was systematically co-opted to shield his deep moral contradictions from the American public. Trusted staffers acted as literal gatekeepers, monitoring hallways, clearing rooms, and maintaining an absolute code of silence that protected the president's reputation at all costs. This institutionalized facilitation created a highly insular, profoundly toxic environment where the gravity of executive responsibility was constantly compromised by the logistical demands of a hyperactive, high-stakes secret life. The psychological toll of this dual existence fell heaviest upon Jacqueline Kennedy, who was neither blind to her husband's systemic betrayals nor powerless within the complex dynamic of their partnership. Contemporary historical analyses, supported by the candid reflections of close social insiders like Truman Capote and Gore Vidal, reveal that the First Lady possessed a remarkably clear, painfully realistic understanding of her husband's psychological compulsions. She monitored the whispered rumors surrounding his various mistresses with an intense, quiet intelligence, utilizing her emotional distance as a psychological shield to protect her own sanity and dignity. In the hyperconservative political landscape of the early 1960s, a high-profile divorce was completely unthinkable, an action that would have instantaneously obliterated JFK's presidential aspirations and brought catastrophic social ruin upon their children. Consequently, Jackie consciously chose a path of calculated composure and public stoicism, transforming her public appearance into an armored uniform that protected her family's immense political capital. She understood that her participation in the grand illusion of Camelot was absolutely essential, choosing to master the theater of the presidency while privately enduring the profound humiliation of her husband's reckless behavior. This profound split reality became the definitive overarching feature of John F. Kennedy's life, creating a strange psychological paradox that puzzled even his closest confidants and modern psychological historians. In the public sphere, he was the model of rationalist enlightenment, a cool, detached crisis manager who could look into the abyss of nuclear annihilation during the Cuban Missile Crisis and maintain absolute intellectual clarity. Yet the very same discipline, foresight, and emotional restraint that he exhibited on the global stage completely evaporated when he crossed the threshold into his private quarters. He remained a man perpetually driven by an insatiable need for conquest, youth, and high-stakes secrecy, seemingly addicted to the intense thrill of living on the absolute edge of catastrophic exposure. This internal tension between profound public responsibility and erratic private impulse suggests a deeply fractured psyche, one that required the constant validation of dangerous personal risks to balance the crushing weight of global leadership. It was within this fragile, inherently unstable psychological ecosystem that a chance encounter in a glittering Nevada casino would transform his private indulgences from a mere marital tragedy into a monumental national security crisis. The fateful intersection of Kennedy's secret life and the dark world of organized crime occurred on February 7, 1960, at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas, a glitzy establishment heavily controlled by the American mafia. It was here that Frank Sinatra, acting as the ultimate social catalyst, introduced the charismatic presidential candidate to an elegant 25-year-old woman named Judith Campbell. The timing of this introduction was extraordinarily volatile. Kennedy had recently announced his historic candidacy for the presidency and was aggressively hunting for backroom political endorsements, union support, and massive financial contributions. Sinatra, deeply desperate to secure a permanent place of influence within a potential Kennedy administration, viewed Campbell as a valuable social asset who could further bind the ambitious politician to his glamorous West Coast orbit. Campbell was already a sophisticated fixture within the exclusive Rat Pack social hierarchy, a woman of striking beauty and immense poise who was thoroughly accustomed to navigating the complex, high-stakes egos of immensely powerful men. What Kennedy did not fully comprehend, or perhaps chose to recklessly ignore, was that Campbell was simultaneously moving within a terrifyingly different social sphere, one populated by the most ruthless leaders of the American underworld. Judith Campbell was not merely a beautiful Hollywood companion. She was a dangerous nexus point connecting the highest echelons of political ambition to the violent underworld of organized crime, specifically through her intimate relationships with two notorious mob figures. She had been romantically involved with Sam Giancana, the brutal iron-fisted boss of the Chicago Outfits, and maintained a close ongoing relationship with John Rosselli, the handsome, highly lethal Los Angeles mob representative. The romantic liaison between Kennedy and Campbell ignited quickly in the wake of their Las Vegas introduction, gaining significant intensity just as his presidential campaign gathered unstoppable national momentum. Even after Kennedy successfully assumed the presidency and moved into the White House, the secret relationship continued unabated, with Campbell reportedly making numerous clandestine visits to the executive mansion and the president's private hotel suites. This unprecedented level of access meant that a woman intimately connected to the apex leaders of organized crime was regularly entering the most secure, sensitive political spaces in the entire world. For the directors of national security, this was no longer a matter of a politician's private moral failings. It was a catastrophic vulnerability that threatened the sovereign integrity of the United States government. The terrifying security implications of this affair did not escape the notice of J. Edgar Hoover, the legendary, ruthlessly pragmatic director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who operated the nation's most expansive domestic intelligence apparatus. The FBI had already placed Judith Campbell under intense, round-the-clock surveillance due to her deep, undeniable associations with Giancana and Rosselli, tracking her financial transactions, travel arrangements, and social contacts. When Hoover's agents discovered that their primary surveillance target was regularly communicating with and visiting the President of the United States, the bureaucratic alarms within the Department of Justice rang with deafening urgency. In the hyper-paranoid atmosphere of the early Cold War, where foreign intelligence agencies and domestic subversives were constantly seeking leverage against American leadership, this relationship represented an existential nightmare. The terrifying possibility that structural leaders of organized crime could blackmail the President of the United States, or indirectly influence executive policy through a shared romantic partner, was a reality that Hoover refused to ignore. The FBI director immediately began compiling a massive, highly classified intelligence dossier, transforming the president's secret romantic indulgence into a powerful political weapon that could be used to compromise the executive branch. This domestic intelligence crisis unfolded against a backdrop of unprecedented geopolitical instability, a period where the United States was locked in a desperate life-or-death struggle for global dominance against the Soviet Union. The Kennedy administration was already reeling from the catastrophic public humiliation of the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, an executive disaster that had severely damaged the young president's reputation for strategic competence. Furthermore, a tense, deeply adversarial summit meeting in Vienna with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had left Kennedy visibly shaken, exposing the fragile, terrifyingly thin line that separated global peace from total thermonuclear war. It was precisely at this moment of extreme national vulnerability that the commander-in-chief was actively maintaining a secret romantic relationship that exposed him to potential blackmail by the American mafia. The profound disconnect between Kennedy's public rhetoric, which called for supreme national sacrifice and absolute vigilance against foreign threats, and his reckless private vulnerability was staggering. Hoover recognized that if the details of the Campbell affair were leaked to the public or acquired by foreign intelligence services, the credibility of the American presidency would be completely shattered on the global stage. Faced with this escalating threat, J. Edgar Hoover initiated a series of aggressive bureaucratic maneuvers designed to confront the administration with the cold, undeniable reality of their catastrophic security breach. The FBI intensified its electronic and physical surveillance of Judith Campbell, meticulously documenting her long-distance phone calls to the White House switchboard, her travel itineraries, and her continuing clandestine meetings with Sam Giancana. Hoover compiled these damning findings into a highly detailed, explosive official memorandum and delivered it directly to Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, the president's fiercely protective younger brother. The political irony of this confrontation was incredibly sharp and deeply painful for the administration. Robert Kennedy had built his entire public identity and political career on a relentless, highly publicized crusade against organized crime. As the nation's top law enforcement officer, the younger Kennedy was actively deploying the full power of the federal government to destroy the criminal empires of the very men who were sharing a romantic partner with his brother. The official memorandum from Hoover was a clear, devastating warning that the president's private conduct was actively paralyzing the administration's most important domestic policy objective. The crisis reached its absolute boiling point on March 22, 1962, when J. Edgar Hoover arrived at the White House for a private, highly secretive luncheon meeting with President John F. Kennedy. While no official transcript or audio recording of this high-stakes confrontation exists within the National Archives, the historical aftermath provides unmistakable evidence of what transpired behind those closed doors. Hoover presented the president with the irrefutable evidence compiled by the FBI, demonstrating that federal intelligence agencies possessed absolute proof of his relationship with Campbell and her ongoing communications with the Chicago underworld. The implicit subtext of the meeting was terrifyingly clear. The president's secret life was no longer a secret, and his continued recklessness had compromised his ability to govern independently of bureaucratic blackmail. Facing the immediate destruction of his presidency, Kennedy was forced to capitulate instantly, recognizing that the wall of protection he had relied upon for so long had finally been breached by his own government. Within hours of the meeting's conclusion, the president severed all direct contact with Judith Campbell, initiating a desperate, rapid effort to erase any administrative trace of their shared history. The immediate fallout from the Hoover confrontation extended far beyond the termination of the affair, triggering a permanent, highly visible fracturing of Kennedy's relationships with his Hollywood facilitators, most notably Frank Sinatra. The symbolic break occurred during a highly anticipated presidential trip to California, where Kennedy had originally been scheduled to stay at Sinatra's lavish Palm Springs estate, which the singer had extensively renovated at immense personal expense to accommodate the leader of the free world. Acting on the urgent, uncompromising advice of Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the president abruptly canceled his reservations at Sinatra's compound, choosing instead to stay at the home of Bing Crosby, a conservative Republican entertainer. Sinatra was left deeply humiliated, furious, and permanently alienated from the political inner circle he had worked so tirelessly to court, recognizing that his proximity to power had been instantly revoked due to the mob associations he had helped facilitate. This dramatic shift was a clear, desperate public signal that the Kennedy administration was attempting to purge itself of the dangerous, corrupting influences that had compromised its integrity. The era of reckless Hollywood synergy was officially over, replaced by a desperate reassertion of executive caution that came far too late to prevent the historical damage. Decades later, the full historical weight of this dangerous liaison was laid bare before the American public when Judith Campbell Exner published her explosive bombshell memoir, detailing the intimate mechanics of her time within the Kennedy orbit. While mainstream establishment historians initially attempted to dismiss her stunning revelations as the sensationalized fabrications of a woman seeking attention, subsequent declassifications of FBI surveillance logs verified the core architectural details of her narrative. Most alarmingly, Exner claimed that she had functioned as a literal courier between President Kennedy and Sam Giancana, carrying highly sensitive political communications and mysterious packages that bypassed standard government channels. While the exact, granular nature of those secret communications remains a subject of intense historical debate, the fundamental consensus among modern scholars is deeply damning. The affair occurred, it was a massive breach of security, and it posed a genuine, unprecedented danger to the United States. The terrifying reality that a sitting president could allow his personal impulses to create a bridge between the Oval Office and organized crime forever altered the historical understanding of the Kennedy legacy. Furthermore, the deeply troubling revelations surrounding the Campbell affair provided immense, enduring fuel to the labyrinth of conspiracy theories that emerged in the wake of John F. Kennedy's tragic assassination in Dallas. For decades, investigative researchers and historical skeptics have pointed to the president's secret intersections with figures like Giancana and Rosselli as a potential motive for a high-level mob hit, suggesting that the underworld felt betrayed by an administration they had secretly assisted. The narrative of a president who used the resources of organized crime to secure an election, only to turn the power of the federal government against those same entities, created a powerful motif of vengeance and lethal blowback. While a definitive legally binding connection between Kennedy's private relationships and his assassination has never been conclusively proven in a court of law, the historical reality of his mob proximity ensured that suspicion would permanently cloud the official narrative. The Campbell episode stands as a stark, cautionary monument to how a single private decision, made in a moment of unbridled personal indulgence, can ripple outward across history, compromising the perceived integrity of an entire nation. If the secret relationship with Judith Campbell represented a calculated institutional and political risk to the presidency, John F. Kennedy's intersection with Marilyn Monroe embodied an entirely different category of danger, an emotional and psychological volatility magnified exponentially by the blinding glare of global celebrity. By the time Monroe entered the inner social orbit of the Kennedy administration, she was no longer merely a successful Hollywood actress. She had evolved into a transcendent, highly volatile cultural icon who commanded the obsessive attention of the entire world. Yet beneath the radiant, carefully manufactured facade of blonde glamour and effortless sex appeal lay a profoundly fragile, deeply traumatized human being who wrestled constantly with severe clinical depression, substance addiction, and an insatiable psychological need for emotional validation. When these two massive cultural forces collided, the potential for a catastrophic public explosion was instantly apparent to everyone within the president's protective inner circle. Monroe was not a discreet Washington insider who understood the unspoken rules of political survival. She was an unpredictable, highly visible force of nature whose emotional instability made her completely incapable of maintaining the rigorous secrecy that Kennedy's survival demanded. The dangerous intersection of their public and private worlds reached its absolute historical peak on May 19, 1962, at a massive, highly publicized Democratic fundraising gala held at Madison Square Garden in New York City. In front of an audience of thousands of political donors, journalists, and national figures, Marilyn Monroe stepped onto the stage, shed a magnificent white fur coat to reveal a breathtaking, skin-tight gown encrusted with thousands of glittering rhinestones, and delivered her iconic performance of Happy Birthday, Mr. President. Her vocal delivery was extraordinarily breathy, intensely intimate, and laced with an undeniable undercurrent of raw eroticism that instantly transformed a standard political tribute into a public declaration of private intimacy. The sheer audacity of the performance sent an electric shockwave through the crowded arena, instantly igniting a firestorm of public speculation and journalistic gossip that threatened to melt away the carefully constructed veneer of the Camelot mythology. Kennedy attempted to diffuse the immense public tension with a witty, self-deprecating joke upon taking the stage, but the historical damage was already done. The line between public duty and private indulgence had been crossed on national television. Behind the glittering spectacle of that historic New York night, however, the actual relationship between the president and the iconic actress appears to have been remarkably brief, fundamentally unstable, and marked by a profound asymmetry of emotional investment. Historical evidence and the subsequent testimonies of close White House insiders suggest that Kennedy viewed his encounters with Monroe as entirely casual, a temporary indulgence with the ultimate Hollywood trophy that required absolutely no long-term emotional commitment or personal sacrifice. For Monroe, however, the psychological stakes of the relationship were dangerously high. She reportedly viewed the charismatic, immensely powerful president as a romantic savior figure who could provide the permanent emotional security and profound validation that had eluded her throughout her tragic life. This profound emotional disconnect created a highly volatile dynamic, where Monroe's escalating desperation and frequent unscripted attempts to contact the president began to trigger severe anxiety within the executive branch. Kennedy's patterns of behavior consistently demonstrated a cold, calculated detachment once a personal conquest had been achieved, a psychological reality that Monroe's fragile, deeply vulnerable psyche was completely unprepared to accept. Part 2. The absolute refusal of John F. Kennedy to acknowledge the profound emotional volatility of Marilyn Monroe highlights the ultimate systemic failure of the protective apparatus that surrounded his presidency, an architecture that consistently prioritized the immediate gratification of the commander-in-chief over the long-term stability of the executive office. A rare, heavily scrutinized photograph taken during an exclusive private gathering at the home of Democratic heavyweight Arthur Krim on the night of the Madison Square Garden Gala provides a haunting, singular visual confirmation of their shared world, capturing a moment where the public masks of both figures momentarily slipped. In the frame, Kennedy stands with his back partially turned, engaged in a quiet, intense conversation with Monroe, while Attorney General Robert Kennedy watches from the periphery with an expression of profound, guarded vigilance. This image, which survived a sweeping, aggressive effort by federal agents to confiscate and destroy all photographic evidence of the two icons together, stands as a permanent historical testament to the dangerous reality that unfolded behind the public festivities. For decades, this singular photograph fueled a vast labyrinth of historical investigation, serving as irrefutable proof that despite the administration's desperate public denials, Monroe occupied a central, highly destabilizing position within the president's innermost social circle. As the summer of 1962 progressed, Monroe's psychological state deteriorated rapidly under the weight of professional isolation, failing health, and the profound emotional sting of Kennedy's sudden, absolute detachment from her life. Investigative journalists and historical biographers, most notably Seymour Hersh in his groundbreaking revisionist history of the Kennedy presidency, have argued persuasively that Monroe's escalating erratic behavior began to be viewed as a clear and present danger to national security by the administration's inner circle. Reports from intelligence wiretaps and private detective agencies operating in Hollywood indicated that Monroe was becoming increasingly vocal about her intimate relationships with powerful men, frequently threatening to hold a massive press conference to expose the secret details of her time with both John and Robert Kennedy. The terrifying prospect of the world's most famous actress publicly dismantling the meticulously engineered illusion of the Kennedy family structure triggered a state of near panic within the Department of Justice. The protective apparatus that had successfully managed Washington gossip columnists for years found itself completely powerless against the unpredictable, media-saturated orbit of a desperate, emotionally fractured Hollywood icon who had absolutely nothing left to lose. When Marilyn Monroe was found dead from an acute barbiturate overdose in her modest Brentwood home on August 5, 1962, the tragic event instantly detonated a catastrophic wave of public suspicion, conspiracy theories, and enduring historical skepticism that continues to shadow the Kennedy legacy to this day. The sudden, deeply mysterious nature of her passing, combined with the immediate, highly irregular intervention of unknown individuals who reportedly purged her home of personal journals, phone records, and diary entries, ensured that the truth would be permanently obscured. Whispers of high-level political assassinations, state-sponsored cover-ups, and direct intervention by federal intelligence agencies began to circulate wildly through the global press, suggesting that Monroe had been systematically silenced because she possessed lethal, compromising knowledge regarding the private lives of the nation's leaders. While no definitive, legally binding forensic evidence has ever emerged to substantiate the dark claim that she was murdered by order of the government, the undeniable reality of her intense proximity to the Kennedy brothers created an environment where such terrifying theories could permanently thrive. The intersection of her tragic demise and the secret life of the presidency served as a grim reminder that within the high-stakes world of elite politics, personal vulnerability is often viewed as an unacceptable institutional liability that must be neutralized by any means necessary. Years later, acclaimed celebrity biographer J. Randy Taraborelli exposed an even deeper, profoundly intimate layer of psychological complexity surrounding this historical tragedy, revealing that the emotional shockwaves of Monroe's presence had penetrated into the most private, deeply guarded sanctuaries of Jacqueline Kennedy's personal life. Through meticulous research and interviews with former medical staff, Taraborelli revealed that the First Lady discovered, to her profound horror, that the prominent New York psychoanalyst she was secretly consulting to cope with the immense trauma of her marriage had previously treated Marilyn Monroe. This staggering realization was far more than an uncomfortable coincidence. It was a devastating psychological violation that symbolized how completely the specter of her husband's infidelity had seeped into the most vulnerable, therapeutic corners of her existence. The terrifying realization that the very same medical professional was analyzing the profound grief of the betrayed wife and the erratic desperation of the rumored mistress exposed the deeply tangled, deeply toxic human web that John F. Kennedy's reckless impulses had spun around those he claimed to love. For Jackie, it was an agonizing confirmation that no matter how elegantly she constructed the public walls of Camelot, she could never truly escape the compromising orbit of her husband's private behavior. The tragic reality that Monroe had actively imagined a genuine, permanent future with the president, even indulging in vivid romantic fantasies about displacing Jacqueline Kennedy to become the First Lady of the United States, underscores the profound level of psychological manipulation that defined these high-stakes relationships. Historical accounts indicate that Monroe had even gone so far as to make a direct, highly bizarre phone call to the White House, during which she calmly informed a composed, emotionally detached Jackie of her intentions to marry her husband. Whether these grand, cinematic dreams of political permanence had any basis in reality remains entirely doubtful, as Kennedy's lifelong pattern of behavior demonstrated a cold, unyielding habit of absolute emotional detachment once a personal conquest had been finalized. For Kennedy, Monroe was an item of immense social prestige, a dazzling prize to be enjoyed in the shadows, but discarded the very moment her presence threatened the stability of his ultimate prize, his political power. Yet for Monroe, the fleeting, intense attention of the leader of the free world felt like the ultimate, long-sought affirmation during a bleak period marked by intense professional struggle and profound personal isolation. Her tragic death added a dark, permanent layer of sorrow to the myth of Camelot, illustrating a terrifying dynamic where a president who could effortlessly project confidence and structural control on the global stage was utterly incapable of managing the collateral human damage of his private desires. While the high-profile affairs with global icons like Marilyn Monroe and Judith Campbell captured the imagination of subsequent generations, the most deeply troubling and ethically compromised aspect of John F. Kennedy's private life involves his patterns of behavior toward exceptionally young, vulnerable women who were drawn into his immediate political orbit. Decades after the grand illusion of Camelot had been permanently shattered, a courageous woman named Diana DeVeg came forward to deliver a devastating, deeply analytical account of an intense affair that began when she was a 20-year-old student at Radcliffe College. Kennedy, who was twice her age, a powerful United States senator and a married father, utilized the full, intoxicating weight of his political stardom to systematically dismantle the young woman's emotional boundaries. DeVeg vividly recalled the chilling moment their eyes locked across a crowded political dinner, an encounter that resulted in her being immediately invited to sit directly beside the rising political star under the patronizing, deeply manipulative guise that a tired old man wanted to sit next to a pretty girl. This initial meeting initiated a multi-year, highly secretive relationship that DeVeg would later describe not as a grand, romantic Hollywood adventure, but as a profoundly destabilizing, psychologically destructive experience that derailed her sense of self for decades. In her deeply moving, intellectual reflections published in her later years, DeVeg fundamentally shifted the historical discourse surrounding Kennedy's romantic legacy, moving the conversation away from harmless, glamorous philandering toward a sharp critique of structural power imbalance and male entitlement. She wrote with blistering clarity about how Kennedy operated seamlessly within a pervasive, highly toxic mid-century patriarchal mythology that actively equated elite political power and physical attractiveness with an absolute right to personal consumption. Her candid testimony exposed a calculated methodology of seduction, wherein a young, impressionable student was made to feel uniquely special by the future leader of the free world, only to be kept in a state of permanent emotional dependency and structural isolation. DeVeg's account demonstrated that Kennedy's private conduct was not a series of impulsive, romantic lapses in judgment, but rather a predatory, highly systematic exercise of immense political and social authority over individuals who possessed absolutely no means of self-defense. This historical revelation permanently altered the understanding of the Camelot era, revealing that the president's legendary charisma was frequently weaponized to exploit the very citizens he was constitutionally sworn to protect and elevate. An equally stark, deeply unsettling confirmation of this predatory dynamic emerged with the publication of a bombshell memoir by Mimi Ford, who stepped forward to detail her experiences as a 19-year-old White House press office intern during the absolute height of the Kennedy presidency. Alford's account was remarkably devoid of romantic sentimentality, painting a stark, clinical picture of an administration where vulnerable young women were systematically integrated into the daily logistical routine of the executive mansion to service the personal desires of the president. She recounted with painful clarity how she lost her virginity to the commander-in-chief in the First Lady's private bedroom a mere 4 days after beginning her internship, an encounter that initiated an intense, 18-month secret relationship. Alford described a highly structured, deeply cynical system of facilitation managed by Dave Powers and other trusted presidential aides, who regularly arranged for her inclusion on official administrative trips and coordinated her clandestine entries into the president's private quarters. Throughout her narrative, Kennedy emerges as a figure of immense magnetic charm but absolute emotional detachment, a leader who maintained a strict, impenetrable wall between his private indulgences and his public family structure, completely unconcerned with the psychological well-being of the teenager he was exploiting. Most alarmingly, Alford's detailed memoir recounted specific, deeply troubling episodes that crossed the line from simple consensual infidelity into the territory of genuine recklessness, emotional cruelty, and deeply inappropriate coercive behavior. She described instances where the President of the United States, operating with an absolute sense of impunity, issued high-pressure personal dares that forced her to engage in inappropriate sexual acts with his close friends and administrative staff while he watched with detached amusement. In one particularly chilling account, Kennedy reportedly ordered Alford to perform a sexual act on his trusted aide, Kenny O'Donnell, during a private gathering, exploiting her absolute obedience and profound fear of displeasing the president to test the absolute limits of his control. These dark revelations completely transformed Kennedy's enduring historical reputation, stripping away the harmless myth of the charming, handsome rogue, and replacing it with the reality of an individual operating within a deeply corrupted system that actively enabled the exploitation of vulnerable young women. The White House, under this analytical lens, ceases to be viewed merely as the center of enlightened global democracy, emerging instead as a highly insulated playground where the absolute authority of the executive branch was routinely abused for personal amusement. This systemic pattern of personal exploitation extended deep into the operational ranks of the permanent White House staff, creating an atmosphere where female employees were frequently evaluated through a lens of physical attractiveness and sexual availability rather than professional competence. Highly reliable oral histories and contemporary White House journals indicate that Kennedy possessed a profound, near-obsessive fascination with youth and vitality, consciously surrounding himself with a cadre of young, physically striking female secretarial assistants who were known informally among staff as Fiddle and Faddle. These women, identified historically as Jill Cowan and Priscilla Ware, were granted extraordinary, highly irregular access to the private quarters of the executive mansion, frequently accompanying the president on official retreats while the First Lady was absent. The pervasive nature of these arrangements was so thoroughly understood within the immediate family structure that Jacqueline Kennedy once famously delivered a sharp, devastating blow to the grand illusion during an official White House tour. Turning to a prominent French journalist while passing Priscilla Ware's desk, Jackie remarked in flawless, ice-cold French, "This is the girl who is supposed to be sleeping with my husband," a moment that revealed the deep, underlying anger that she was forced to suppress for the sake of political continuity. To fully comprehend the historical trajectory of John F. Kennedy's reckless behavioral matrix, one must recognize that his dangerous blurring of the lines between private desire and national vulnerability was established long before he ever set foot inside the Oval Office. During the dark, anxious early years of the Second World War, while serving as a young, ambitious officer within the United States Office of Naval Intelligence, Kennedy initiated a highly passionate, intensely dangerous romantic affair with a beautiful Danish journalist named Inga Arvad. Arvad was an extraordinarily sophisticated, highly connected international media figure who had previously moved within the highest political circles of Nazi Germany, having attended the high-profile wedding of Hermann Göring and been personally photographed sitting in an intimate setting with Adolf Hitler, who had publicly praised her perfect Nordic beauty. Because of these deeply alarming international associations, the Federal Bureau of Investigation placed Arvad under intense, comprehensive counterintelligence surveillance, utilizing electronic wiretaps and physical tailing to determine if she was operating as a deep-cover espionage agent for the Axis powers. Consequently, the young John F. Kennedy's passionate weekend trysts with Arvad were meticulously documented by his own government's intelligence agencies, creating a highly volatile situation where a naval officer with access to classified documents was sharing a bed with a suspected foreign spy. The immense gravity of this wartime security breach eventually forced the direct, heavy-handed intervention of the Kennedy family patriarch, Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., a man whose own immense political ambitions for his sons were constantly threatened by John's profound lack of personal restraint. Recognizing with absolute clarity that an official military court-martial or a public espionage scandal would permanently obliterate his son's future political viability before it had even begun, Joseph Kennedy utilized his immense wealth and formidable political leverage to force a separation. The young naval officer was abruptly transferred out of his sensitive intelligence post in Washington and reassigned to a remote, grueling tour of duty in the South Pacific, a disciplinary relocation that accidentally set the stage for his subsequent heroic actions aboard the PT-109. This early high-stakes wartime episode serves as a critical historical blueprint for Kennedy's entire life, illustrating a dangerous, recurring psychological pattern where the intense thrill of crossing prohibited boundaries completely blinded him to the catastrophic geopolitical consequences of his behavior. The Arvad affair demonstrated that even when faced with the absolute realities of global warfare, Kennedy viewed personal desire as an autonomous zone that existed entirely above the laws of national security and military discipline. As his political star rose rapidly through the post-war era, Kennedy's romantic resume expanded to include a dazzling, multi-layered array of high society figures, international aristocrats, and legendary Hollywood icons, each relationship adding another layer of risk to his public career. He engaged in an intense, deeply complicated romance with the radiant Hollywood actress Jean Tierney, a relationship that progressed to the absolute brink of marriage before Kennedy abruptly terminated the connection because Tierney's complex family history and Hollywood career were deemed politically disadvantageous by the family apparatus. During a high-society summer trip to Europe, the young senator initiated a passionate, highly secretive affair with a stunning Swedish aristocrat named Gunilla von Post, an intense relationship marked by clandestine meetings in remote European hotels and a long-standing exchange of deeply emotional, highly revealing personal letters. Even the legendary, fiercely independent international entertainer Marlene Dietrich found herself drawn briefly into Kennedy's insatiable orbit, later describing a brief, highly impulsive encounter inside the White House that occurred when she was decades older than the young president, an episode she recalled with a mixture of amusement and profound bewilderment. Each of these high-stakes encounters reinforced a dangerous internal narrative within Kennedy's psyche, convincing him that his immense personal charm granted him an absolute, perpetual passport to cross any social, moral, or geographical boundary without ever paying a meaningful price. However, as the icy, paranoid tensions of the Cold War reached their absolute zenith during the early 1960s, Kennedy's total inability to curb his private appetites exposed his administration to increasingly sophisticated, deeply terrifying forms of foreign espionage and political manipulation. A profoundly dangerous case study in this category of national vulnerability involves Ellen Roemsch, a strikingly beautiful 27-year-old German-born woman who had recently immigrated to Washington, D.C. as the wife of a West German military official. Roemsch quickly established herself as a prominent, highly sought-after fixture within the exclusive, deeply corrupt circles of the Quorum Club, an elite, highly secretive social establishment located within the Carroll Arms Hotel directly across from the United States Senate. The club was a notorious, alcohol-fueled clearinghouse where powerful politicians, defense contractors, and high-level lobbyists gathered to broker backroom deals, and it was heavily supplied with beautiful women who functioned as high-class hostesses and companions for the capital's elite. Rumors soon began to swirl frantically through the intelligence community that Roemsch had secured direct, regular access to the president's private quarters, a revelation that sent shockwaves of panic through the Federal Bureau of Investigation due to deep, structural concerns regarding her background. The true, terrifying nature of the Röhmsch crisis lay in her complex personal history, as federal intelligence agencies discovered that she had grown up in East Germany and had reportedly maintained deep, highly suspicious family connections to communist officials before escaping to the West. The FBI launched an intense, high-priority investigation into her activities, operating under the deeply alarming working hypothesis that Röhmsch was utilizing her high-level sexual access to the American political elite to function as a deep-cover Soviet bloc intelligence agent. The terrifying prospect that a woman actively suspected of East German espionage was sharing an intimate relationship with the President of the United States at the exact moment the world was balancing on the edge of nuclear war over the Berlin crisis was a reality that threatened to completely destroy the administration. Faced with the immediate threat of a catastrophic public exposure that would have instantly paralyzed the executive branch, Attorney General Robert Kennedy intervened with ruthless, clinical efficiency, utilizing the full power of the State Department to abruptly deport Röhmsch back to West Germany before congressional investigators or investigative journalists could uncover her connection to the president. The desperate, high-stakes suppression of the Ellen Röhmsch scandal represents one of the most profound, deeply disturbing instances of executive power being deployed to bury evidence of a president's reckless personal behavior under the absolute guise of national security. To ensure that the mainstream press remained completely silent regarding the deportation and its underlying causes, the Kennedy administration reportedly utilized a mixture of intense financial pressure, political leverage, and selective leaks of compromising information against congressional leaders who threatened to launch a formal public inquiry. This ruthless, highly effective containment operation demonstrated that the survival of the Kennedy political brand had become an absolute priority that superseded the public's fundamental right to know if their commander-in-chief had compromised the security of the nation. The Röhmsch episode illustrated with terrifying clarity that the president's private life was no longer an isolated matter of personal morality. It had become an active national security liability that required the systematic manipulation of the American legal and political architecture to manage and conceal. Part 3. The deep, structural entanglement of John F. Kennedy's private desires and the vast, secretive architecture of the American intelligence state reached its most haunting, profoundly enigmatic apex in his intense relationship with an extraordinary woman named Mary Pincott Mayer. Mayer was a remarkably sophisticated, fiercely independent abstract painter who moved with effortless grace through the most exclusive, deeply influential echelons of high society Washington, possessing an elite pedigree that granted her unparalleled access to the centers of national power. She was the sister-in-law of legendary Washington Post editor Ben Bradlee, and most critically, she was the former wife of Cord Mayer, a brilliant, high-ranking CIA official who directed the agency's most sensitive clandestine operations and domestic psychological influence programs. Unlike the young interns or Hollywood starlets who cycled through the president's life, Mary Pincott Mayer was an intellectual peer, a woman of profound political sophistication who possessed a deep, highly nuanced understanding of the dark machinations of the Cold War national security apparatus. Her relationship with Kennedy was deeply intimate, characterized by regular, highly secretive visits to the White House private quarters when Jacqueline Kennedy was away, during which the two reportedly engaged in intense conversations regarding international diplomacy, nuclear disarmament, and the potential for a global cultural transformation. The profound historical danger surrounding Mary Pincott Mayer intensified exponentially in the wake of Kennedy's tragic assassination, as whispers began to circulate frantically through the Capitol that she had meticulously recorded the intimate details of her relationship with the president inside a private personal diary. According to subsequent historical accounts and memoirs penned by her close associates, this highly sought-after journal contained far more than mere romantic reflections. It reportedly detailed the president's private doubts regarding the Cold War, his deep frustration with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and his secret desire to dismantle the absolute power of the Central Intelligence Agency. On October 12, 1964, less than a year after Kennedy's death, Mary Pinchot Mayer was brutally executed while walking along the historic Chesapeake and Ohio Canal towpath in Georgetown, shot twice at point-blank range by an unknown assailant in broad daylight. The sudden, highly professional execution-style murder was never conclusively resolved by law enforcement, and the immediate, highly irregular response from the intelligence community ignited a firestorm of enduring historical suspicion. Hours after her tragic passing, James Jesus Angleton, the legendary, fiercely paranoid chief of CIA counterintelligence, was caught red-handed attempting to break into Mayer's private art studio to locate and confiscate her secret diary, initiating a desperate scramble that resulted in the journal being systematically destroyed by the agency. The chilling, unexplained demise of Mary Pinchot Mayer and the immediate, high-level destruction of her personal records stand as a dark, permanent monument to the profound human costs and structural dangers that defined the secret life of John F. Kennedy. The fact that the chief of counterintelligence for the CIA viewed the private reflections of a president's deceased mistress as an immediate institutional threat that required a covert domestic operation reveals how deeply Kennedy's personal impulses had compromised the boundaries of national security. Whether Mayer was silenced because she possessed lethal, compromising knowledge regarding the true mechanics of the presidency, or because her diary threatened to expose the dark intersections of executive power and intelligence operations, remains one of history's most haunting, unresolved questions. Together, these complex, high-stakes relationships assemble a historical portrait of the 35th president that stands in stark, devastating contrast to the polished, sanitized imagery of Camelot that was systematically broadcast to an unsuspecting American public. Kennedy's undeniable genius, his profound rhetorical brilliance, and his genuine capacity for historic global leadership were permanently bound to a dark, insatiable trail of systemic deception, reckless vulnerability, and profound moral contradiction. When evaluating this vast, deeply troubling historical record through a modern analytical lens, the fundamental question that emerges is no longer whether John F. Kennedy engaged in these reckless behaviors, but rather how these private actions actively altered the grand course of global history. To view his systemic infidelities as mere personal peccadillos, isolated flaws in an otherwise brilliant and complicated statesman, is to fundamentally misunderstand the intricate, high-stakes mechanics of executive power during the absolute height of the Cold War. Each secret affair was not a victimless, private indulgence. It was an open vulnerability, a standing invitation for domestic blackmail by bureaucratic actors like J. Edgar Hoover, and an active avenue for foreign espionage during periods of supreme international crisis. The immense, exhausting amounts of administrative energy, federal resources, and legal maneuvers deployed by the Department of Justice to systematically bury these scandals could have been utilized to navigate the monumental domestic and international challenges facing the Republic. The myth of Camelot was maintained at an astronomical cost, requiring the absolute complicity of the mainstream media, the corruption of federal law enforcement, and the emotional destruction of countless young women who were viewed as entirely disposable assets. Furthermore, the profound disconnect between Kennedy's public rhetoric of generational responsibility and his private pattern of predatory, reckless behavior forces a radical reassessment of the moral legacy of his administration. The very same president who stood before the world and declared that the torch had been passed to a new generation of Americans, calling for supreme civic sacrifice and absolute ethical commitment, was privately operating within an insular system of absolute entitlement and systemic exploitation. His patterns of conduct toward young interns like Mimi Alford and impressionable students like Diana DeVeg reveal a man who viewed his immense historical position as a mechanism to bypass traditional human ethics with total impunity. This analytical reality does not diminish his monumental achievements in navigating the Cuban Missile Crisis or his foundational steps toward civil rights legislation, but it adds a profound, permanent layer of tragedy to his historical legacy. John F. Kennedy remains an immortal, endlessly fascinating icon of the American experience, but the true historical lesson of his life lies within the dangerous, fragile space where public grandeur meets private rot, demonstrating that the ultimate test of leadership lies not within the curated theater of power, but within the silent, unvarnished corners of human character. As we look back at the enduring, brilliantly constructed illusion of the Kennedy presidency from the vantage point of the 21st century, the absolute destruction of the Camelot mythology serves as a vital case study in the evolution of media consumption and political transparency. The mid-century era allowed a charismatic leader to inhabit two entirely separate, completely contradictory universes simultaneously, relying upon a compliant, deeply protective press corps to curate a masterpiece of public theater while his private reality bordered on absolute chaos. Today, such systemic deception would be completely impossible, instantly dismantled by the relentless, decentralized nature of modern digital journalism, social media scrutiny, and a profound cultural shift that rightly demands absolute personal accountability from public figures. This historical transformation highlights a deep, permanent shift in how humanity evaluates its leaders, recognizing that a politician's treatment of vulnerable individuals in the shadows is a direct, infallible indicator of their fundamental integrity as a public servant. The hidden history of John F. Kennedy stands as a profound reminder that the most dangerous adversaries a leader faces are rarely the foreign superpowers across the geopolitical chessboard, but rather the unbridled, unexamined impulses that lurk within their own soul. The profound historical ripples of Kennedy's secret life continued to warp the landscape of American politics long after his tragic death in Dallas, establishing a highly toxic, deeply cynical precedent that subsequent generations of leaders would systematically exploit. The successful preservation of his pristine public image through the systematic manipulation of federal intelligence agencies and mainstream media gatekeepers provided a highly effective, deeply dangerous blueprint for the evasion of political accountability. Future administrations looked at the survival of the Kennedy brand and concluded that the absolute preservation of executive power justified the corruption of legal institutions, the illegal monitoring of private citizens, and the systematic destruction of compromising evidence. The dark legacy of Watergate, the systemic deceptions of the Vietnam War era, and the subsequent high-profile personal scandals that periodically paralyzed the modern presidency can all trace their structural lineage back to the sophisticated containment operations engineered by the Kennedy Inner Circle. By demonstrating that an administration could successfully break the law to protect the personal secrets of the commander-in-chief, the architecture of Camelot inadvertently initiated a profound erosion of public trust in the fundamental integrity of the American government. Moreover, the severe emotional and psychological trauma inflicted upon the women who were drawn into the toxic orbit of Kennedy's private desires highlights a profound human cost that establishment historians have spent decades callously minimizing or actively erasing from the official record. For a generation, women like Judith Campbell, Marilyn Monroe, Diana DeVeg, and Mimi Alford were systematically reduced to the status of historical footnotes, salacious punchlines, or unstable fabrications, their genuine voices aggressively suppressed to protect the pristine, sacred memory of a martyred president. This collective gaslighting of vulnerable individuals by the academic and media establishments represented a secondary, deeply insidious abuse of power, a coordinated effort to ensure that the human collateral of Kennedy's desires never tarnished the romantic marketability of the Camelot legend. The courageous, belated efforts of these women to reclaim their personal narratives in their later years provided a vital, deeply unsettling corrective to the official mythology, forcing a patriarchal historical establishment to finally confront the uncomfortable realities of executive entitlement. Their testimonies stand as a powerful, permanent testament to the historical reality that behind every grand, beautifully curated political romance, there is often a trail of silent suffering, broken lives, and profound human betrayal. The intricate, high-stakes intersection of Kennedy's private conduct and the dark machinery of the Cold War national security state also exposes a profound, structural irony that lies at the absolute heart of his historical legacy. The president who entered office promising to project absolute, uncompromising American strength against the global forces of totalitarianism was privately dependent upon a highly secretive, deeply compromised domestic network to protect his own survival. This absolute dependence upon figures like J. Edgar Hoover and various intelligence operatives meant that the commander-in-chief was never truly free to govern independently of the bureaucratic entities he was constitutionally empowered to oversee. The secret knowledge of his vulnerabilities granted these unelected, deeply entrenched intelligence directors immense, unaccountable leverage over the executive branch, effectively transforming the president into a partial hostage of his own personal indiscretions. This dangerous dynamic permanently altered the internal balance of power within the United States government, accelerating the rise of an insulated, unaccountable deep state that could effortlessly manipulate elected leadership by holding the literal keys to their private destruction. Ultimately, the comprehensive, multi-layered breakdown of the secret life of John F. Kennedy forces us to abandon the comforting, simplistic dichotomies of traditional historical biography and embrace a far more mature, profoundly challenging understanding of human nature and political leadership. He was not a flawless, shining prince of democracy, nor was he an entirely unredeemable villain. He was an extraordinarily brilliant, deeply fractured human being who inhabited a position of historic, near-absolute power during an era of unprecedented global peril. His immense contributions to the human experience, from his inspiring vision for space exploration to his cool-headed preservation of global peace during the absolute brink of nuclear apocalypse, exist simultaneously alongside his systemic deceptions, personal exploitation, and profound lapses in national security judgment. To fully comprehend his place in the historical narrative, one must possess the intellectual honesty to look directly into both the dazzling light of his public achievements and the deep, unsettling darkness of his private impulses. The true history of his life remains a fascinating, deeply cautionary exploration of the American experience, an enduring testament to the reality that the pursuit of great power is always a double-edged sword, and that the ultimate judgment of history spares no one, not even the legendary inhabitants of Camelot. The enduring fascination with Kennedy's private life also reveals a profound psychological truth about the nature of modern society's relationship with celebrity, political power, and historical myth-making. The American public's collective willingness to participate in the grand illusion of Camelot long after the first cracks in the facade appeared suggests a deep, ongoing cultural need for romanticism and larger-than-life heroes who transcend the mundane realities of bureaucratic governance. People did not simply fall in love with John F. Kennedy, the policymaker. They fell deeply in love with the cinematic promise of youth, elegance, and intellectual vitality that he and his family effortlessly projected on the global stage. This intense, emotional investment created a powerful psychological resistance to any incoming information that threatened to disrupt the beautiful narrative, causing millions of citizens to actively look away from the mounting evidence of his severe personal recklessness. The slow, painful dismantling of this historical myth over subsequent decades functioned as a profound collective loss of innocence for the nation, forcing a society to grow up and recognize that its leaders are never gods, but flawed, complicated human beings who carry the exact same frailties as those they govern. Furthermore, when analyzing the profound systemic corruption that occurred to protect Kennedy's secrets, it becomes chillingly evident that the true danger to the Republic was not the specific acts of infidelity themselves, but the absolute willingness of national institutions to compromise their integrity to maintain the grand deception. The fact that the Secret Service, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Justice, and the mainstream media all consciously chose to participate in a coordinated multi-year cover-up represents a catastrophic failure of constitutional checks and balances. This institutionalized complicity set a deeply dangerous precedent, demonstrating that the structural apparatus of the state could be effortlessly co-opted to serve as a private public relations firm for a powerful individual rather than a guardian of public law and objective truth. The long-term consequences of this institutional subversion were devastating, contributing directly to a pervasive, deeply cynical cultural atmosphere where modern citizens expect their government to routinely lie, manipulate evidence, and prioritize the survival of the political elite over the fundamental rights of the public. The dark intersections between Kennedy's private life and the violent world of organized crime, as illustrated through the Judith Campbell Exner affair, also serve as a stark historical warning about the volatile, unpredictable nature of backroom political alliances. The dangerous illusion that an ambitious politician can utilize the immense resources, social leverage, and clandestine support of the criminal underworld to secure power, and then effortlessly discard those entities once a goal is achieved, represents a supreme form of hubris. The subsequent trauma, paranoia, and endless conspiracy theories that permanently engulfed the administration in the wake of this mob proximity demonstrate that the dark forces of the underworld can never be truly controlled or managed by political theater. The blurred lines between the Oval Office, the glittering casinos of Las Vegas, and the violent streets of Chicago created a highly toxic, profoundly volatile political ecosystem where a single miscalculation could trigger catastrophic consequences for the entire nation. This historic lesson remains a powerful, timeless reminder that when elite public service compromises its foundational ethics to dance with the forces of corruption, the entire structural integrity of the state is placed in immediate, catastrophic jeopardy. Similarly, the profound asymmetry of emotional investment and structural power that defined Kennedy's interactions with Hollywood icons like Marilyn Monroe highlights the deeply mercenary, profoundly transactional nature of his approach to human relationships. The legendary actress, who desperately sought a genuine sense of human protection and emotional permanence within the highest echelons of political power, found herself instead treated as a high-value piece of social currency, an item of prestige to be enjoyed in secret, but discarded the moment her presence threatened the stability of the president's political career. This ruthless, highly calculated detachment, once a personal conquest had been finalized, illustrates a profound lack of empathy that stood in direct, devastating contrast to the warm, deeply humanitarian public persona that Kennedy projected to the world. The tragic human collateral of this emotional coldness, culminating in the mysterious, sorrowful demise of the world's most iconic actress, added a permanent, haunting layer of grief to the enduring legacy of Camelot, demonstrating that the pursuit of personal gratification without moral restraint always leaves a trail of profound human devastation in its wake. In the final historical analysis, the hidden, deeply complex history of John F. Kennedy's private life does not serve to completely erase his genuine, monumental achievements on the global stage, but rather to contextualize them within the messy, unvarnished realities of the human condition. He remains one of the most brilliant, charismatic, and genuinely consequential leaders in the history of the American Republic, a statesman whose profound rhetorical vision and cool-headed crisis management successfully steered the world away from the catastrophic abyss of total nuclear annihilation. Yet, his enduring legacy must always carry the heavy weight of his private actions, serving as an absolute, permanent warning to future generations that immense intellectual capacity and historical greatness can exist simultaneously alongside profound moral failure and reckless personal vulnerability. The complete story of the 35th president is a monumental, multi-layered tragedy of epic proportions, a vivid demonstration that the ultimate test of any true leader lies not within the curated, glittering theater of public power, but within the silent, unvarnished corridors of their own private character, where no public relations apparatus can ever alter the ultimate judgment of history. As this profound, deeply analytical breakdown of the hidden sides of history draws to a close, it leaves us with an enduring, highly relevant question that challenges our fundamental understanding of leadership, historical memory, and the true cost of political mythology. Do you believe that these high-stakes, deeply secretive affairs actively changed the monumental course of global history by compromising national security and institutional integrity? Or were they simply the unfortunate personal flaws of a deeply complicated man navigating an unprecedented era of global crisis? The rich, multi-layered historical record compiled here suggests that the truth lies somewhere within the complex, highly volatile space where public duty and private impulse collide, a territory where every secret action carries a permanent consequence that echoes across generations. We invite you to deeply reflect upon these powerful historical realities. Share your insightful thoughts, analyses, and perspectives in the discussion below. And join our ongoing community by subscribing for more rigorous, unfiltered, and deeply revealing deep dives into the complex, hidden sides of our shared global history.